It began not in a dungeon, nor in the depths of some forgotten plague pit, but in a brightly lit apothecary, the kind whose shelves gleamed with glass jars, whose polished counters smelled faintly of rosemary and rot. The doctor stood before them, a man revered for his intellect, a man who believed himself the heir of Hippocrates and Galen. His name was whispered with respect among the physicians of Europe in the late 16th century, when medicine was as much alchemy as it was science, and when the boundary between cure and curse blurred like ink in water. He was no monster, not at first, merely a man desperate to heal in an age where death arrived daily, where the air itself seemed diseased. In those years, famine gnawed through the countryside, plagues returned like unholy tides, and the human body, broken and blistered, had become both battlefield and relic. To mend it, men like him turned not to gods, but to flesh. For in the twilight of the Renaissance, the body of man was believed to contain its own salvation. Blood, fat, bone, and marrow, every ounce a key to some hidden balance of humors, every fragment an echo of divine architecture. And so it was that doctors began to prescribe not wine, but human blood, not herbs, but ground skull, not oils, but the essence of the dead. The idea was neither born of madness nor heresy, but of philosophy. The ancients had said, like cures like, that the vitality of one being might restore another. What then could be more potent than the essence of man himself? This was the reasoning that animated Europe's most learned physicians, men in velvet robes who quoted Aristotle and mixed remedies in golden mortars. The poor called it sorcery, the rich called it science, and the church, ever ambiguous when profit and power aligned, looked the other way. Apothecaries from London to Leipzig stocked what they called mumia, a powder scraped from the darkened flesh of mummified bodies stolen from Egyptian tombs, ground fine and mixed with honey or wine. It was sold as a cure for epilepsy, bruises, bleeding, melancholy, and even love. But soon, when the supply of ancient corpses dwindled, new sources were found closer to home: the gallows, the battlefield, the execution square. The condemned became the healers of kings. Their bodies, once cast aside, were rendered sacred by the physician's logic. If death took them unjustly, their flesh might yet serve life. So it was that this doctor, who had studied at Padua, who had written treatises on the circulation of fluids and the nature of spirit, began to experiment. He would attend executions not as a spectator, but as a collector. When a thief or murderer swung from the rope, he would approach, cloaked, silent, his servants carrying jars and cloth. Blood was caught before it cooled, sometimes drunk warm by those who could afford such a luxury, for the vital spirit was thought to fade with the temperature. Skulls were taken from the scaffold and ground into dust. Fat was boiled into ointments to treat joint pain or seizures. Each part of the body had its purpose, each texture its virtue. There was a grim logic to it, an order so precise it seemed almost divine. He kept records, meticulous, clinical, noting doses, outcomes, failures. The dead had become his pharmacy. At first he treated only the desperate, soldiers with shattered bones, peasants blistered by plague. But word spread quickly. Soon, noblemen sent their servants to his door, demanding elixirs made from the flesh of youth or the blood of the recently hanged. He obliged, not out of greed, but out of belief, for he saw in their recovery proof of his own righteousness. When a count's fever broke after swallowing powdered skull mixed with wine, the doctor saw confirmation of natural law. When a baron's epileptic fits ceased after drinking a draught infused with human blood, the doctor felt awe, not disgust. He was not feeding on humanity's corpse, he was redeeming it. And yet, beneath that conviction, something darker began to stir. For power, once touched, demands to be felt again. The doctor began to choose his specimens with care. Not all bodies, he wrote, were equal. The flesh of a young man executed unjustly was most potent, for innocence strengthened the vital spirit. The fat of a criminal, on the other hand, might taint the medicine with wickedness. He began to believe he could sense purity, that he could hear it in the way a condemned man cried, or smell it in the blood as it cooled. He prayed before dissections, invoking divine mercy as his knife slipped into the pale blue veins of the dead. His assistants whispered that he never blinked, that he seemed to see not bodies but vessels, broken chalices from which he might pour the essence of life itself. In his laboratory, the air grew thick with paradox. Shelves filled with labeled jars, sanguis virginis, pinguedo homicidae, calvaria pueri, virgin's blood, murderer's fat, the skull of a child, all neatly arranged, all sanctified by purpose. The walls smelled of death and candle wax. The students who came to learn left pale, trembling, some sickened, some converted. And yet, in the journals of the time, his name appears among the respected. His remedies were sold in royal courts. His lectures drew crowds. His experiments were cited by scholars who never saw his eyes when he worked. Outside, Europe changed. The wars of religion raged. The Black Death returned. The boundaries of the known world expanded, and yet, in the heart of every physician, the same ancient hunger remained, to defeat death, to bend the body's secrets to their will. And so, as plague carts rolled through the streets of London and Paris, as prayers echoed through cathedrals thick with incense, men lined up to buy small brown vials labeled simply mumia vera, true mummy, medicine born of the grave. They would hold it to the light and see the dust shimmer faintly within, the shimmer of ground bone, of blood turned to resin. They would drink it, grimacing, hoping. Some claimed it worked, others died faster. The doctor did not care. For each failure, he told himself, brought him closer to understanding. He was no longer merely a healer. He had become the priest of a new communion, one in which flesh replaced faith, and the human body became its own sacrament. And in that conviction, he found both triumph and damnation. For even the purest devotion to science can rot when it forgets compassion. And in the silence of his chamber, surrounded by the preserved remains of those he once swore to heal, the doctor began to realize that his search for life had led him only deeper into death. The doctor's reputation spread beyond his small city. Ambassadors carried his concoctions to courts across Europe, each vial wrapped in silk, each drop a whispered promise of immortality. In Prague, Emperor Rudolf II was said to have kept a vial of the philosopher's blood among his alchemical curiosities. In London, noble physicians debated his writings on the vital spark, quoting his assertion that the human body contained within it a divine principle, not metaphorical, but literal, that could be extracted and consumed. He became a legend, half healer, half sorcerer, the man who bridged medicine and necromancy. But the truth was not grandeur. The truth was a cellar beneath his home, cold and damp, lined with jars that sweated in the dark. He slept poorly, his dreams full of mouths whispering from the shelves. Sometimes, when he woke, he thought he could hear breathing from the jars, the sigh of preserved fat, the faint pulse of dried blood, as though life clung still to the memory of its vessel. He told himself these were fancies born of exhaustion. He had spent too many nights grinding bone to powder, too many dawns weighing the proportions of flesh against the needs of the living. His apprentices had begun to flee, muttering prayers as they left, saying that his eyes glowed red in the candlelight. But he stayed his course. The body, he reasoned, was merely the container of God's mechanism. To use it as remedy was no more blasphemous than harnessing fire to cook food. And yet even he began to feel the fracture in that logic when he looked upon the faces of those who brought him fresh specimens. The executioners came now, not as servants of justice, but as partners in trade. They brought him heads still damp with blood, limbs freshly severed, and in return they were paid in silver, the coin of salvation minted by death. It was in the winter of 1602 that his confidence faltered. A boy, scarcely 16, had been executed for theft, a loaf of bread stolen from a noble stable. The doctor, desperate for pure material, purchased the body for a handful of ducats. He instructed his assistants to drain the blood before it clotted, but as they worked, the boy's face, pale, childlike, almost peaceful, seemed to gaze up at him through the dim candlelight. Something in that stillness pierced the armor of his conviction. He could not lift his scalpel. For the first time, he wondered whether he was not healing the sick, but feeding the sickness of the world itself, the sickness that devoured the poor to comfort the rich, that consumed the innocent to preserve the guilty. But his moment of doubt was brief. His mind, ever rational, smothered it with philosophy. The boy, he told himself, was already dead. The good of the living outweighed the dignity of the corpse, and so he worked. The journals from that winter are meticulous. He notes temperatures, weights, symptoms, but between the lines, in the ink's tremor, there is a kind of unease. He began to write less of cures, more of transformation, of how consuming the essence of another might not merely heal, but change the soul itself. He theorized that the vital spirit of the deceased might mingle with the drinkers, merging memories, temperaments, perhaps even fates. It was no longer medicine. It was communion, a transference of self through flesh. He called it pharmacon divinum, divine medicine. The priests condemned him, though quietly, for the bishops' wives still sent for his elixirs in secret. Meanwhile, across Europe, others followed his example. Apothecaries in Germany sold tinctures of human blood collected from public executions. In Paris, powdered skull from the catacombs became fashionable among the wealthy. Even the devout, cardinals, monks, men of prayer, consumed the body of man as casually as they consumed the body of Christ. For they believed the world itself was decaying, that the dead might grant strength where God had withdrawn it. The doctor watched this spread and felt pride lace with terror. He had given mankind a mirror, and it had smiled back with its teeth showing. By 1610, his fame had curdled into notoriety. Students whispered that he no longer procured corpses but created them, that he bled patients under the guise of experiment, that he believed fresh blood, still living, was most efficacious. No proof survives, but one letter from a rival physician mentions a noblewoman who vanished after visiting his house for treatment. Another tells of strange sounds at night, of chanting and weeping intermingled. Whether rumor or truth, his name became a symbol of forbidden curiosity, the man who turned medicine into consumption. Yet to him, this was no madness. It was a revelation. He believed he had uncovered the primal truth of existence, that life was cyclical not metaphorically but materially, that the living fed on the dead as the dead had once fed on them. To heal was to consume. To preserve life was to devour it. The soul, he wrote in one surviving note, is not housed within us. It circulates, dissolving, reassembling, perpetually shared. In that sentence lies the seed of both his genius and his ruin. The church moved against him in 1612, not openly, for he still treated bishops and cardinals, but through whispers and inspections. A tribunal was convened in secret to determine whether his practices bordered on necromancy. When the inspectors entered his home, they found not demons, but order. Ledgers, jars, labeled instruments. Nothing unlawful, nothing divine. And yet, as one chronicler wrote, there hung in the air a stench that was neither of rot nor spice, but something in between, as though the line dividing the living from the dead had worn thin. The doctor was not condemned, but he was watched. His students dwindled, his patrons withdrew. He spent his final years largely alone, visited only by a few loyal clients, and the occasional priest eager to debate philosophy. He grew gaunt, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling from the quicksilver he had used in his tinctures. Yet his mind remained sharp, brilliant even, and until his last days he wrote, not treatises this time, but reflections. In one he confessed that perhaps he had mistaken knowledge for virtue, that to touch the fabric of life required not intellect, but humility. I sought to cure death, he wrote, and found only its patience. When he died, no one claimed his body. His neighbors feared contagion. His house was sealed, his papers burned. But the jars remained, row upon row of silent witnesses, their contents drying to dust. And centuries later, When historians found fragments of his writing preserved in university archives, they discovered that his theories, stripped of their horror, had predicted truths about blood and vitality that science would not confirm for 200 years. In the end, he was neither saint nor monster, merely a man who mistook hunger for hope. The legend of the doctor did not die with him. It lingered, drifting through the universities and monasteries of Europe like the faint scent of formaldehyde. Students of anatomy spoke his name with both reverence and revulsion, as one speaks of Prometheus, the thief of divine fire. His surviving formulas, rescued from the flames by apprentices who could not bear to see his life's work erased, circulated quietly in manuscript form. They bore cryptic titles: Elixir Sanguinis, Unguentum Vitae, De Essentia Corporis Humani, and in their margins, readers scribbled cautious admiration. To some, he was a visionary who had glimpsed the future of medicine. To others, the herald of corruption, the proof that knowledge, untethered from morality, consumes itself. Yet the practices he pioneered did not vanish. They changed their names, cloaked themselves in respectability, and found new hosts. In the royal courts of Europe, powdered skull became a fashionable remedy for headaches and melancholy. Executioners sold fresh blood from the scaffold as a restorative tonic. Apothecaries stocked jars of man's grease, rendered from the bodies of the hanged, for treating wounds and bruises. Physicians recorded such uses without irony, listing them beside camphor, myrrh, and mercury. Even the devout participated. Martin Luther himself, when ill, reportedly drank a spoonful of human blood, calling it God's strange gift to man. The idea had taken root too deeply to die. It had become medicine's unspoken shadow, an acknowledgement that healing, in its most primal form, requires sacrifice. By the 17th century, this doctrine had matured into a philosophy of empire. Europe was expanding, its ships carrying not just spices and gold, but new diseases, new corpses, new curiosities, and with them traveled the belief that the body, any body, might serve as a resource. Colonial physicians dissected enslaved men under the guise of study. Apothecaries in Amsterdam imported mummified remains from Egypt by the ton. The trade in death became global, and somewhere beneath all this enterprise lay the ghost of that first doctor, smiling faintly through the centuries, the man who had once said that life circulates. But Europe was changing in subtler ways too. The Enlightenment dawned, bringing microscopes, dissections, and a new vocabulary of the body. Words like circulation, tissue, organism replaced humor, essence, spirit. Yet for all its rationality, the new science could not fully purge the old hunger. Physicians still bled patients to balance their humors. They still prescribed meat and blood as tonics for weakness. Only the language had changed, not the impulse. What had once been mystical was now called physiological. What had once been cannibalism was now nutrition. The shadow endured, wearing a white coat instead of a priest's robe. In 1653, a young German doctor named Oswald Kroll wrote of the noble virtue in the red spirit of man, describing blood as the essence of warmth, courage, and life. He claimed to have revived dying patients by feeding them human blood mixed with wine. His peers debated not whether it was moral, but whether it was effective. And in England, Thomas Willis, later hailed as a pioneer of neurology, declared that blood was imbued with the soul's heat and might pass that vitality to others. Behind their rhetoric, one can still hear the whisper of that Renaissance apothecary, grinding bones by candlelight, convinced that he was perfecting God's design. Yet the moral tide was shifting. The Protestant Reformation, with its obsession for purity of body and faith, began to recoil at the practice. Philosophers mocked it as barbarism disguised as science. By the early 18th century, powdered mummy had become a relic of superstition. Yet even then, it appeared in the inventories of pharmacies from Paris to Copenhagen. The wealthy, desperate for cures to gout and consumption, continued to consume the dead, though they called it by gentler names. It was, as one contemporary observed, a quiet horror the age refused to see. Still, The doctor's ghost persisted not only in apothecaries but in thought. His writings on circulating essence prefigured ideas that would shape modern biology. Long after his jars had crumbled, scientists rediscovered that blood indeed carried the body's vitality, that life could be transferred through transfusion, a practice born centuries later in the same lands that had once condemned his art. Irony, it seemed, was as eternal as death. But history has its own conscience, and it began to turn against the memory of flesh-made medicine. When Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Diderot, Condorcet, unearthed accounts of cannibal cures, they used them as proof of the Church's hypocrisy, of the grotesque extremes to which faith and fear had driven man. They saw in it the symbol of Europe's sickness, a civilization that preached resurrection, yet feasted on its own dead. The doctor's philosophy, once whispered in reverence, was now quoted in disgust. He became a parable, the cautionary saint of science without soul. Yet perhaps the most haunting legacy of his work was not in what men did to the dead, but what they came to believe about the living. For in treating the body as a resource, they began to measure worth in flesh, to weigh one man's vitality against another's, to dissect humanity itself into hierarchies of usefulness. From the scaffold to the colony, the logic remained the same, that the weak could nourish the strong, that death was merely a tool. It was a philosophy that would echo far beyond medicine, into politics, into war, into every ideology that ever justified cruelty as necessity. And so, in the silence of history, the doctor's experiment never truly ended. Its methods evolved, its language refined, but its essence endured. In every laboratory where progress is bought with suffering, in every policy that trades lives for greater good, the same reasoning breathes, that life can be consumed, repurposed, perfected. The apothecary's jars may be gone, but their reflection remains in the polished glass of every modern institution that calls itself humane. When the doctor first lifted a goblet of blood to the light, he saw salvation glimmering in it. Centuries later, mankind still does. Only the vessels have changed. They found his journals in the early 1800s, sealed inside a chest beneath the ruins of a monastery in the Bavarian Alps. The parchment had darkened with age, the ink faded to rust, yet the words were legible enough to chill even the most rational mind. There were formulas written in Latin, diagrams of veins and nerves, and long meditations on the alchemy of vitality. One passage, written in a trembling hand, read, "When the soul departs, its fire remains trapped in the vessel of flesh. To waste it is blasphemy, to redeem it is divine." The scholars who read it argued for months whether it was theology or madness. Some called it proto-science, others necromancy disguised as philosophy. But when they came to the final page, a list of experiments conducted for the resurrection of vigor, the chamber fell silent. Each line was dated, each subject unnamed, only marked as donor A, donor B, donor C. The discovery sparked controversy across Europe. Newspapers called him the cannibal doctor of the Renaissance, though his real name, now eroded by centuries, was likely a pseudonym anyway. Universities debated whether to classify his work as heretical or visionary. One Parisian anatomist defended him, saying, "He understood before any of us that matter and spirit are one." Another, horrified, responded, "He understood nothing but the vanity of playing God." The journals were confiscated, sealed in state archives, and quietly forgotten, until modern historians, centuries later, found fragments quoted in obscure alchemical texts. It was one such fragment that reignited the story in the 20th century, when a German physician named Dr. Albrecht Weiss claimed that the doctor's writings anticipated the concept of biochemical energy transfer. He was not a monster, Weiss wrote in 1933, but a pioneer misunderstood by his time. The timing of that defense was ominous, for it came at a moment when Europe once again began speaking the language of purification, essence, and the worth of flesh. Within a decade, laboratories would conduct experiments in the name of progress far darker than any apothecary's brew. The doctor's ghost had returned, this time dressed in a lab coat under banners of nationalism. But long before that century's horrors, The doctor's legend had already shaped a quieter kind of shadow, the moral indifference of science. From the Enlightenment forward, physicians had sought the boundary between life and death with increasing boldness. They electrocuted corpses to simulate movement, transfused animal blood into humans, dissected criminals minutes after execution. Each act, justified by curiosity, was an echo of his creed, that the body's mystery was worth the desecration of its vessel. And each time, when questioned, they used the same defense: that knowledge absolves. Even the church, which had once burned his books, found itself unable to fully condemn what he represented. For deep within Christian mysticism lay the same paradox: salvation through flesh. Communion itself was a ritualized form of consumption, a symbolic drinking of blood, eating of body. What the doctor had done was only to strip away the metaphor. In his hands, theology became chemistry, and faith became anatomy. He had not betrayed religion, perhaps. He had only taken it literally. In the villages of Germany and France, centuries after his death, whispers of his art survived as folk cures. Mothers mixed powdered mummy into wine for sick children. Priests collected holy oil, said to come from the bodies of the incorrupt dead. Apothecaries sold tinctures made from human fat under new names: Oleum hominis, Unguentum miraculum. The people no longer knew the doctrine's origin, but they kept its practice alive, believing that what once held life could still grant it. In that sense, the doctor had succeeded. He had taught Europe to believe that healing came from consuming what had died. And when that belief finally collapsed, it did not vanish. It transformed. The 19th century replaced blood with industry, flesh with resource, but the logic endured. Coal, oil, labor, colonies, each became a kind of harvest, extracted from one body to feed another. The world learned to call it progress, not medicine, but the rhythm was the same: take, refine, consume, repeat. Humanity had simply expanded the apothecary's shop to planetary scale. Even now, if you look closely, traces of the doctor's creed remain. In cosmetics that promise to rejuvenate using placental cells, in transfusion clinics where the blood of the young is given to the old, in the rhetoric of health economies that measure life by its profitability. We have refined the process, wrapped it in ethics and paperwork, but the essence is unchanged. We are still trying to distill immortality from mortality, still drinking the elixir of others' suffering in quieter, sanctioned ways. The irony is almost poetic. The doctor who once ground bones into powder was condemned as a monster, yet his descendants, modern researchers, surgeons, biotechnologists, are celebrated as saviors. He worked in darkness, surrounded by whispers. They work under sterile light. He fed kings with tinctures of blood. They feed societies with transfusions, organ transplants, and chemical miracles. But at the root of both lies the same hunger, that life, if properly dissected, might yield its secret. And if he were alive today, walking the halls of a modern hospital, hearing the hum of machines that breathe for the dying, perhaps he would smile, not with pride, but recognition. For all our progress, we have only perfected his dream. We no longer grind skulls, but we still believe that vitality can be extracted, measured, stored. The same alchemy, now sanitized by science. The doctor's name is lost, his bones turned to dust long ago. Yet somewhere in every vial of plasma, every preserved organ, every medical breakthrough that trades risk for revelation, his shadow lingers, not as villain, not as saint, but as reminder that beneath the white light of knowledge, there still flickers the red fire of appetite.